Good morning and welcome to our April webinar. I'm Brian Wallace. I'm the Director of Marketing at Kiefer Consulting, and we do these webinars every month. They're 30 minutes in length, and we cover kind of a variety of topics associated with SharePoint, Office 365. This month we're focusing on migrations, and the title of the presentation is The Building Blocks of a Successful Migration. We'll be recording today's call and recording the webinar as well, and we'll post it later to our YouTube channel. So I'd like to thank you all for joining. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the panel over to the side and input your questions there, and we'll be happy to try to answer them as we move through the presentation. We'll also have a brief few minutes at the end of the session to answer any questions that might come up. So I'm going to pass it over to Matt Green, who is our senior consultant. And Matt, you ready to go here?
Yep. All right.
All right.
Let's do this.
Great.
We got lots to cover today. So thanks, Brian. I'm Matt Green. I'm a senior consultant with Kiefer Consulting. And for those who don't know who Kiefer Consulting is, we specialize in providing consulting services basically around SharePoint and other Microsoft products like Office 365 and Azure services. So one thing that we found ourselves doing a lot recently is helping our customers migrate to new versions of SharePoint and SharePoint Online with Office 365. And so today we wanted to share with you our expertise in providing some best practices and building blocks that we use for the successful migrations. So today we'll be covering a lot of information. I'm hoping we're going to get through everything in 30 minutes. But we're going to quickly start by talking about why you might migrate to SharePoint and SharePoint Online. Then we'll cover some of the migration options. And then from there, we'll go into sort of the building blocks, the pre-migration assessment, the methodology that we suggest, and the best practices for each one of those things. So to start, let's try to answer that question. Why are organizations moving information to SharePoint Online? Well, SharePoint Online has a lot of benefits and should be a strong contender for consideration in your future plans for SharePoint. For starters, it fully utilizes and integrates with Office 365 and other features like OneDrive for Business. So you're getting a lot of extra benefits right out of the box, right? In addition, you're going to get the latest features and updates first. So the update cycle for SharePoint Online is much smaller compared to on-prem. So you're going to get the latest and greatest right out the bat when they're released. The third, by moving to the cloud, you're going to be improving your security and your reliability. Microsoft's money-back SLAs guarantee an extremely high availability of your environment, so you don't have to worry about outages or downtime. In addition, they help lead the standard in the industry for data security. So you can be sure that your information is safe in Microsoft's hands. A fourth reason is basically to reduce your infrastructure. So when you're on-prem, or on-premise as it's called, you have to manage the servers and equipment for your own environment. But in the cloud, Microsoft takes care of all that for you, kind of leaving you to be able to build out your business processes and not have to worry about support and maintenance of an infrastructure. And then finally, SharePoint Online and Office 365 provides improved collaboration with new features like Office 365 groups and teams. So there's a lot of extra functionality that comes with that. So with all the benefits and new features of Office 365 or SharePoint 2016 on-premise, there's a strong business case to start to migrate over to these new and updated platforms. But you may be wondering, is this possible for us, right? And the answer is likely yes. There are many different migration scenarios, but most all are possible within SharePoint, including migrating files from file shares to SharePoint. So how does your organization go about planning and executing this sort of migration to SharePoint? Well, that is what I'm hoping to kind of cover today with you guys, is the first steps and the process around that. So the first step to planning a migration is to understand the approaches and the methods available to you to use in your migration efforts, right? So there are really two primary approaches for migration, and these are sort of nicknames I've given them, but they're like what I like to call the lift and shift or the knit and pick approach. So a lift and shift approach is exactly what it sounds like. You're moving everything as is. You're just lifting it from one environment and putting it in another. So typically, there's not going to be any changes to your environmental structure. There's not going to be changes to your metadata or your content. You're just kind of moving everything, the good, bad, and the ugly, into your new environment. The alternative to that is what I call the knit and tick, which is much more granular in regards to what you're moving. So you're going to be doing things like archiving or removing unused content. You're going to be auditing your content. You might actually possibly have changes to your environmental structure or even the metadata that you're storing with your documents. And if you're really lucky, you're going to be defining new governance policies and rules and so forth around your environment. So they're very different approaches. In addition to the approach, there's also the method of how you will be migrating your content. So again, there's two standard approaches to this. There's the all-in-one approach, which is a traditional waterfall approach where you do a lot of planning up front, and then you move all your content for your entire environment in one effort, right? And the alternative to that would be what we call the iterative approach. So the iterative approach, you're basically going to take and do content migration by a group or department or a functional area. So each area really goes through the different stages for content migration and are handled in a more granular level, right? So when you look at sort of the cross-sectioning of the approach and the methods that are available, you start to determine some information about the options that you have. So for instance, on one end of the scale, if you were just to do a lift and shift and an all-in-one migration, you're going to have a lower level of effort, but you're risking more because since you're just basically moving everything and you're not doing any evaluation, there's a chance that things might not work and you might have to do some cleanup after the fact just to get things back to a stable state. On the other end of that spectrum, if you were to do the knit and tick approach and be iterative about that, you're going to have a higher level of effort because you're putting more work into it, but you're going to significantly reduce your risk because you're addressing all of those conflicts and issues early on in the process before you migrate your content. So how exactly do you determine what is the best method and approach to take for your migration? Well, that is where the next step comes in, and that's what we call the pre-migration assessment. And a pre-migration assessment of your current environment is really a critical activity to accurately planning for a successful migration. So conducting this first will help you determine how difficult or easy your migration may be, and it might lead you to determining the best approach and method to take in your migration efforts. So you'll probably hear me say this a lot today, but it is best to start by planning. And this activity does not need to take very long, but if you do this planning and you take a moment to ask yourself some questions up front, you really save yourself a lot of rework later on. So some of the questions you need to ask yourself in this initial planning stage is, what is your source environment? What's your target environment, right? Is there a need for content auditing and cleanup? Is that something that we want to do? You're going to need to also just understand, are we migrating multiple environments together? Is that something that is necessary? And if that's true, are we doing a logical architecture change or information architecture change? So asking these initial questions will help start to guide you in a direction for picking an approach and a method for your migration. It will also start to define what areas to put extra effort into during assessment. So for instance, if there is no plan to migrate your custom branding to your new environment, you can focus less on collecting information about where custom branding is currently implemented and how it's being implemented. So that brings us to the next question. What exactly do you look for in a pre-migration assessment? So the main purpose of the pre-migration assessment is to get a solid understanding of the existing environment that you plan to migrate and the potential areas of conflict to be aware of, right? So like when you're moving to a new house, you may identify some items as fragile. I mean, you might even write that on the box, right? So ensuring that you're handling these items with extra care during the move is really important. And that's what the pre-migration assessment helps us to do. So it helps us to start to identify these important call-outs from your current environment. And this information can then be used to help determine the overall level of effort for the migration. So some of the things that you're going to be looking for during a pre-migration assessment are going to be stuff like file sizes or just the general amounts of content that you have. You're going to look for unused content, and that can include sites, lists, or items. You might want to look for unsupported features, things like templates or for lists or sites, or just features that are no longer available in your target environment. In addition, you want to look for things like abnormalities. That's going to be large files, large lists, things that stick out as non-normal to your environment. And then you want to look for things like custom branding. Are you using master pages? Are you using custom style sheets, along with custom third-party and application solutions that you might have implemented? Because depending on where you're migrating, those things might need to be reconstructed or changed. And then finally, you want to look for things like workflows, because workflows in SharePoint are not easily migrated unless you're using a third-party product like Mintex. So how do you complete these assessments? Well, you can do this manually, which can be a rather tedious effort, or you can conduct your pre-migration assessment using one of the many tools that are available out there. The tool you use will obviously differ based on both your source and your target environment. So some tools require access to the servers, others don't. So you really need to dive into those tools to understand which one might be best for you. Now, the one recommendation I will make is if you're on a SharePoint 2013 environment, I do recommend two tools to use during your assessment. And that's going to be Microsoft's free MAP tool, which is Migration Assessment and Planning tool, and ShareGate. So these two tools together will really give you a full picture of areas in your environment and what it is available to migrate. So once your pre-migration assessment is completed and you've analyzed your findings, you should start to have a good idea of the level of effort for completing your migration. And this is really determined based on what you find. So things like how much content are we doing, like we described? Are we merging from multiple environments? Do we have to do these additional stages for branding and logical architecture? Those all will add to the difficulty of your migration efforts, right? So, but based on your findings, you should also be able to start to select an approach and a method for migration. Are we doing a knit and pick iterative approach, or are we able to just keep things simple because it's a simple level of effort and do a lift and shift, right? So now that we have the foundation for the migration planning, how do you build on top of this foundation to help find success? Well, I'm going to introduce you next to the Kiefer migration methodology that we use for our customers. This is a step-by-step process that we use to drive success in all of our migration efforts. So the Kiefer migration methodology is a multi-stage migration approach that covers the full range of activities that may be required during a typical migration effort. This particular diagram shows these stages when used in an iterative migration approach when migrating to SharePoint Online. And the reason I call that out is because if this was an on-prem to on-prem migration, then you might have an additional physical architecture design stage early on in this process. But what is important to understand is that the results of each stage should flow into the next stage, so helping to push the process along to completion. That's how this has been designed. So if you notice at the top, the first stage is a very important one, pre-migration planning. And this is typically a natural flow or follow-up from your pre-migration assessment. And this is actually the stage where you determine what other stages, the optional stages, you will include in your migration effort. You'll determine resourcing and planning in that sense, and you basically where you will start in this process, because you can fall into the process at different stages. So in our example today, I'm going to actually go through all stages. So we're going to cover the full suite of things that we can offer or that can be done during a migration. And the Kiefer migration methodology allows for 4 optional initial stages. And those are your logical architecture design stage, your information architecture design, your custom branding, and your governance planning stages. So these are optional because although recommended, if you're just doing a lift and shift, then they're not required, right? So you don't need to do custom branding when you're just lifting everything across, right? So however, if you're not doing a straight lift and shift, then these are typically completed first, and because they help define how and where your content will live within the new environment. So these stages are also usually completed only once, since they impact the entirety of your new environment. So if you're using the iterative approach like we are demonstrating here, the next 4 stages should be repeated for each functional areas. And these are going to be the deep content assessment, the ARM analysis, the actual content migration, and then the user validation. So these are designed to provide a deeper understanding and roadmap for the content within each area currently being migrated. So the benefit to this approach is that each area gets the special attention that it needs to have a successful migration. So using this approach ensures nothing is missed or overlooked. So in a complex migration scenario, it is really important to get things right the first time. And an iterative approach allows you to take smaller, repeatable steps to make sure nothing's missed. So let's dive a bit more into each of these stages so we can see the activities that you should complete to be successful. So to start, we're going to start with the logical architecture design stage. And this is basically where you're going to define at a high level the group of content that will share different things like settings, configurations, and policies. A simple example is what we show here. It is pretty easy to distinguish the difference between a department and team site compared to a project site, for instance. A department site is going to be persistent. It's going to have a set group of users versus a project site might have a fixed duration, right, with a start and end date, and it's going to have a combination of people from different departments. So defining and understanding these groups really it helps show the differences within your environment, and then you can build out a site structure in the new environment in a way that will help simplify your future governance and maintenance. So at this stage, you're really just trying to define what this logical architecture is going to look like in your new environment and where things will end up living. So once you've tackled your new logical architecture, you can start to look a bit deeper at your information architecture. So information architecture defines the way content is organized within your logical architecture and will help determine things like what content types you're using in SharePoint, what metadata or fields you're going to use, and potentially even the navigational structure of your site. So if there's a desire for improved search or organization within SharePoint after you migrate your content, then this step is really key to defining how that will work, right? So there's a bunch of steps you should take, but essentially you're going to be evaluating what you currently have. You're going to be engaging with your content owners to define what extra bits of information they could use to better find their content, and then you're going to diagram out how that content's going to live, right? Because you really need to plan how this content's going to live in this new environment. So some best practices that, or tips that we're going to offer for this is, one, you're going to try to keep it logical. You want your information architecture to make sense to everyone who's using it. At the same time, though, you need to make sure it's extensible. So you need to be able to incorporate new types of content as they arise, right? And then obviously, everything should be driven towards a search sort of solution. So search is a core feature of SharePoint, and you will benefit greatly if you're able to use that. So really make sure that you focus around the idea of improving search. So the next stage is going to be taking on custom branding. And again, this is one of those optional stages, so you could pass over this if there isn't a desire to do so. But if there is a desire for something other than the default out-of-the-box team site look and feel, then this stage will need to be completed. So there are really two main options for branding in SharePoint, and you can go with a custom design using custom master pages, or you can try to keep things simple with a custom SharePoint theme. So going the simple route, a SharePoint theme is definitely the simplest way to do that. And the only caveat there is that it's limited in what it can be changed. It really only changes the colors, color look and feel of your site. But on the alternative, if you were to go with a custom master page, you're going to get the greatest amount of freedom in your design, but it's important to note that with SharePoint Online, if you're customizing the master page, you're going to be moving that master page outside of Microsoft's update cycle. And it's going to make it a little bit harder to support in the long run when new features are released. But if you do choose the approach of the custom master page and design, then typical best practices are to first design wireframes to be able to understand the placement of content on pages. And then from there, you're going to design some mock-ups to get an idea of what that final design will look like. So both of these things are going to provide great reference materials for your design team during the development of the custom design. So the next optional stage is one of the most important and also toughest to complete. So this is going to be the governance planning stage. And a SharePoint governance plan is really just a guidebook that outlines the administrative, maintenance, and support tasks within your organization's SharePoint environment. So there's really no better time to define to define these sort of policies than when you're moving to a new SharePoint environment. They will actually help you keep things in order and simplify your ongoing maintenance in the future. So this effort is a bit too large for us to talk in today's webinar, but some best practices to account for is you really want to make sure you understand where you're coming from and where you're going to. And once you understand where you're going to, you can begin to define roles and responsibilities. And again, to do those roles and responsibilities, definitely use your logical architecture because that's what it's there for. The idea, like we defined earlier, we can have different governance rules for our department sites compared to our project sites. And so being able to rely on these things that we did, these earlier stages, it can simplify the process of defining our governance, right? An optional thing that you can do that is highly recommended is forming some sort of governance committee. A committee is really nice because then it puts the hands of enforcement into this committee, and typically you'll put executives or higher level individuals in your organization on that committee to help really enforce these new rules that you're implementing. So next in the migration process comes the iterative migration stages. So these are really the key points. If you're moving past the optional stages, these are the things that you really want to make sure you do to successfully migrate your content. So each of the next 4 stages make up a single iteration and should be completed for each functional area in your organization. So the first is the deep content assessment stage, which we see here. This stage is used when you want to complete a full audit and cleanup of your content prior to your migration, and it will help identify what assets are actually being utilized in your environment. So the simplest way to complete this stage is to select what I call a cutoff date, and that's basically a cutoff date that you're going to use later to qualify content that needs to be evaluated further. So you can then take this cutoff date and run some additional content reports using tools like ShareGate. So essentially you're going to be running reports against this functional area's content to be able to use in your next stage, right? So you can also utilize results that you discovered during your pre-migration assessments. You might have some information already gathered that is going to be useful to help simplify and eliminate some of the work in this stage. And to simplify this stage even further, you're going to want to start at the highest level possible. So evaluate unused sites for your functional area, and then start to dive deeper to the list or library or document level as needed. And so the results of this deep content assessment can then be used in our next stage, which we call ARM analysis. So the ARM analysis stage uses the deep content assessment results to build a migration roadmap of what needs to be migrated, archived, or removed within your functional area. So the deep content assessment should have provided you basically a detailed inventory of your content within the functional area you're attempting to migrate. And then based on those results, you should be able to quickly go down the list and qualify content for archive or removal or migration. So the first qualifier obviously being, does it fall before the cutoff date that we established in that last stage? So at this stage, you should then go through that inventory report and build out and flag each item for its corresponding action. And you want to be able to document this, so you can do this in Excel, or you can even just use a SharePoint list. But the point is to document what action needs to be taken, so that way you're defining a written migration roadmap for the next stage. So again, with that deep content, deep content assessment stage, you want to start this at a high level and work your way down to lists and libraries and documents only when needed. This will help keep this stage as simple as possible, and then from there, you should be ready to migrate. So with the previous 2 stages completed, the actual content migration stage should be relatively simple. So we've done all this planning. We should be able to just take that planning information and get started. So all we really need to do is follow that migration roadmap that we have built out. So it should instruct you on what needs to be archived, what needs to just be removed or deleted, and then what content is actually being migrated to your new environment. The migration itself can be done using a number of different tools, but our recommendation would be to use a migration tool like ShareGate. ShareGate has some of the best backwards compatibility support that we found, and it supports some of the earliest versions of SharePoint. For instance, we have a customer that's using WSF 2.0 SharePoint. That's like from 2003, and it appears to work with those platforms. In addition, one of the features I'm pretty fond of is what they call their pre-check report, which is actually, it will provide you an extra evaluation looking for potential issues right before you start the migration. And so these sort of double checks that are built into the product really help tremendously in making sure you're completing your migration efforts successfully, right? So really the final stage in the iteration for a functional area is going to be your user validation. And this can really be an informal or formal process. It depends on what works best for you and the time that you have to allocate to this. But essentially what you're needing to do is to validate with the content owners that everything is working and as expected in their target environment. So once validation is complete, really the last recommended step is to ensure that the old functional area in the old environment is no longer being used. You don't want users going and adding new documents to the old environment when they should be adding it to the new one. So we actually recommend redirecting things like navigational elements on the old environment. So that way users are beginning to be directed to that new environment when navigating to that functional area in the organization. So this really helps provide a smooth transition for the users and allows them to really start to get used to any changes in the branding or functionality. And as you repeat these stages for the other functional areas, more and more of your organization will move off of the old environment and into the new environment, eventually allowing you to completely remove or archive that old environment once everyone's been migrated over. So once that occurs, you're really ready to end your migration process and roll into the support and closeout phases of the process. So as you've just seen, we've covered a lot in the last 30 minutes, but the Kiefer migration methodology, it's designed to be flexible enough to really help drive a successful migration for any scenario that you might have. So each stage in the process provides a building block for the next, which is what we tried to demonstrate today in this presentation. But it's really helping to guide you to a completed and successful migration by just making sure you're following the steps. So using the techniques and best practices that we've covered today, you should be able to go back to your businesses and hopefully have a greater understanding of how to effectively and successfully migrate your SharePoint environment. I see Brian's coming back on. So I hope you found the webinar useful today. Do you have something you want to say about the slide, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look over in the side panel, there's a little drop-down called handouts, and there's two handouts. There's one that kind of outlines the methodology that Matt covered in the presentation, and also a one-page like infographic that kind of summarizes some of the best practices that we would recommend for folks that are looking at migration. So those could be downloaded there. Also, we've written a couple of blogs recently focusing on migration. You can check them out at kieferconsulting.com. And we've got a lot of content there that might be of interest, so take a look. You could also sign up for our newsletter on the site as well. And if you have any questions about the migration or you want to take a deeper dive, please feel free to contact us. We'd be happy to connect with you on this topic, and we've got a lot of expertise and lots of folks here that are willing and ready to help. So thanks. Are there any questions as we wrap up here? We looks like we did just right, Matt. We were right at the half-hour mark, and we were a little stressed out when we started this call this morning because we were having a little challenge getting this go-to-meeting started. But now that everything's, we got everything going, and we stayed right within the 30 minutes, we do have a couple minutes here. If you do have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the questions panel. And if not, you can always reach out to us via the registration link. My email address is there. And also you can find us at kieferconsulting.com. It doesn't look like there's any questions, Matt, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We'll stop recording, and then what we'll do is also send a link out to the folks that were on today's call so they'll be able to see a recording of this webinar as well and watch it on demand. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate it.